The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Catherine stood by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. The silence in the room was broken only by the distant sounds of London waking up to another day that would be unlike any other in recent memory. William entered the room quietly, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He had been awake for hours, reading through the countless messages of condolence that had been flooding in from around the world. The weight of responsibility sat heavily on his shoulders, but it was nothing compared to the weight of genuine grief that pressed against his chest. "The children are asking questions," Catherine said softly, not turning from the window. Her voice carried the strain of someone who had been holding back tears for days. "George wanted to know why everyone looks so sad. Charlotte asked if we're going to see her again." William moved to stand beside his wife, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Outside, they could see the growing crowd of people gathering near the palace gates. Flowers, cards, and small mementos were being laid in neat piles, creating a colorful tapestry of love and remembrance against the gray morning. "What did you tell them?" William asked, his own voice thick with emotion. "I told them that sometimes very special people have to go away, but that we keep them in our hearts forever," Catherine replied, finally turning to look at her husband. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but there was a strength there that had been forged through years of public service and personal trials. The news had come 3 days earlier, during what should have been a routine family dinner. The private secretary had knocked on the door with an urgency that immediately set everyone on edge. The words that followed had seemed impossible, surreal, like something from a nightmare rather than reality. The beloved figure who had been such a constant presence in their lives, who had guided them through their courtship, their marriage, and their early years as parents, was gone. The person who had taught them about duty, about service, and about putting the needs of others before your own, had passed away peacefully in her sleep. William remembered the phone calls that had to be made, the immediate shift from private grief to public responsibility. There were protocols to follow, arrangements to be made, a nation to inform and comfort. But in that moment, standing in their private apartment with Catherine, he was simply a grandson mourning the loss of someone irreplaceable. "She would want us to be strong for them," Catherine said, speaking about their children, but also about the millions of people who were looking to them for guidance during this difficult time. She always said that leadership meant being a steady presence when everything else feels uncertain. The memories came flooding back unbidden. William recalled childhood visits where he would sit on the floor while she worked at her desk, asking endless questions about everything from state papers to the horses in the stable. She had always taken time to answer, no matter how busy she was, treating his curiosity with the same respect she showed to world leaders and dignitaries. Catherine's memories were different, but equally precious. She remembered their first official meeting, how nervous she had been, and how quickly that nervousness had melted away in the face of genuine warmth and interest. The older woman had asked about her family, her interests, her hopes for the future, making it clear that she saw Catherine not just as William's girlfriend, but as a person worthy of attention and respect in her own right. "Do you remember what she said at our wedding?" Catherine asked, a small smile breaking through her sadness. William nodded. During the reception, she had pulled them aside privately and told them that marriage was like a garden that needed constant tending. "You plant it with love," she had said, "but you keep it growing with patience, understanding, and the willingness to forgive each other's mistakes." The advice had proven invaluable over the years, helping them navigate the unique challenges of a royal marriage lived under constant public scrutiny. Whenever they faced difficulties, they would remember those words and recommit themselves to the work of building a life together. A soft knock at the door interrupted their reflections. Their private secretary entered with the day's schedule, a carefully planned series of events that would begin the formal period of mourning. There would be meetings with government officials, briefings on the funeral arrangements, and the delicate task of balancing personal grief with public duty. "The Prime Minister is arriving at 11, the secretary informed them. "The Archbishop will be here at 2 to discuss the service. And the children's tutor has prepared some age-appropriate materials to help explain what's happening." William nodded, shifting seamlessly into his official role. But Catherine could see the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for his jacket, the way his jaw tightened as he composed himself for the day ahead. "I need a few more minutes," Catherine said quietly. The secretary nodded, understanding, and withdrew, closing the door softly behind him. In the renewed quiet, Catherine moved to the small writing desk in the corner of the room. She pulled out a piece of personal stationery and began to write, her handwriting flowing across the page in the elegant script she had perfected over years of royal correspondence. "What are you writing?" William asked, curious. "A letter to her," Catherine replied. "I know it sounds silly, but I feel like there are things I need to say, things I didn't get the chance to tell her." William didn't think it sounded silly at all. He understood the need to find some way to process the magnitude of a loss, to create a connection that felt real and meaningful even in the face of finality. Catherine wrote about gratitude, about lessons learned, about promises to carry forward the values and traditions that had been entrusted to them. She wrote about the children, about how they would grow up knowing stories about their great-grandmother's wisdom and kindness. She wrote about her commitment to honor the example that had been set for them, to serve with the same dedication and grace that had defined a lifetime of public service. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. She would keep it with her during the difficult days ahead, a private anchor in the storm of public obligation and ceremonial duty. The sound from outside were growing louder as more people gathered to pay their respects. Radio announcers were reading statements of condolence from world leaders. Television crews were setting up equipment to broadcast the events that would unfold over the coming days. The machinery of state mourning was grinding into motion, following procedures that had been refined over centuries of royal protocol. But inside the palace, in the private moments between public appearances, there was simply a family trying to come to terms with an enormous loss. William called his father, their conversation brief, but charged with shared emotion. Catherine spoke with her own mother, drawing comfort from the familiar voice and unconditional support. The children were brought in before William and Catherine left for their first official engagement of the day. George, Charlotte, and Louis sensed the gravity of the situation even if they couldn't fully understand it. They were unusually quiet, staying close to their parents and accepting the extra hugs and reassurances that were offered. "Will you come back soon?" Charlotte asked as her mother prepared to leave. "Yes, sweetheart," Catherine replied, kneeling down to her daughter's level. "Daddy, and I have to go take care of some important things, but we'll be back for dinner. And tomorrow we'll all spend the whole day together." Louis, too young to fully grasp what was happening, but sensitive to the emotional atmosphere, clung to William's leg until he was gently coaxed away by the nanny. The sight of his youngest son's confusion and need for reassurance nearly undid William's carefully maintained composure. As they prepared to leave for their first public appearance since the announcement, William and Catherine took a moment to look at each other, to silently acknowledge the challenge ahead and their commitment to face it together. They had been through difficult times before, but nothing quite like this, nothing that combined personal grief with such an enormous weight of public expectation and responsibility. "She believed in us," William said quietly, adjusting his tie one final time. "She always said we were stronger together than either of us could be alone." Catherine nodded, taking his hand and squeezing it gently. "Then, we'll prove her right," she replied. "We'll show the world what she taught us about grace under pressure, about serving something larger than ourselves." They walked to the door together, ready to step out into the glare of public attention and begin the delicate work of leading a nation through its grief while processing their own. The cameras would capture their every expression, the newspapers would analyze their every word, but they carried with them the private knowledge of love and loss, of lessons learned and promises made. The car was waiting outside, its engine running quietly in the courtyard. Security personnel took their positions with practiced efficiency, creating the protective bubble that would accompany them throughout the day. But no amount of protocol could shield them from the emotional impact of what lay ahead, the challenge of being both genuine in their grief and steady in their leadership. As they settled into the back seat and the car began to move toward their first destination, Catherine reached in her purse and touched the letter she had written. In a few hours, they would meet with the Prime Minister to discuss state funeral arrangements. They would review logistics with palace staff, approve statements for release to the press, and begin the complex choreography of a royal farewell that would be watched by millions around the world. But first, they would simply be themselves, a couple facing the first day of a world that felt fundamentally different without the presence of someone who had been its steady center for so long. The journey ahead would test everything they had learned about duty, about resilience, and about finding strength in each other when everything else seemed uncertain. The black car moved through London's quiet streets, its windows tinted dark enough to provide privacy while still allowing William and Catherine to see the growing tributes that lined their route. Every few blocks, small groups of people stood in respectful silence, some holding flowers, others simply wanting to be present during this historic moment. Catherine watched an elderly woman place a single white rose against a lamppost, her movements deliberate and careful despite her obvious frailty. The sight brought fresh tears to Catherine's eyes as she thought about all the lives that had been touched, all the people who felt a personal connection to the loss they were all experiencing together. "Look at them," William said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of amazement and responsibility. She touched so many lives. People she never even met feel like they've lost someone close to them. The car turned into Downing Street, where a small crowd of journalists and photographers waited behind barriers. The familiar click and flash of cameras began immediately, capturing every angle of their arrival for the morning newspapers and evening broadcasts. William straightened his shoulders, and Catherine checked her appearance one final time, both of them knowing that their composed faces would be seen by millions seeking comfort and reassurance. The Prime Minister met them at the door personally, a breach of normal protocol that spoke to the extraordinary nature of the circumstances. His usual political confidence was tempered by genuine sympathy, and his greeting was warmer and more personal than their typical official interactions. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said quietly, "please accept my deepest condolences. The whole government stands ready to support you and your family during this difficult time." Inside Number 10, the atmosphere was subdued but purposeful. Senior civil servants moved quietly through the hallways, their normal bustle replaced by a respectful efficiency. Everyone seemed to understand that they were participating in history, helping to orchestrate events that would be remembered and studied for generations to come. The meeting took place in the cabinet room, where detailed plans for the state funeral were spread across the polished table. Maps showing processional routes, lists of foreign dignitaries expected to attend, security assessments, and media arrangements created a complex web of logistics that somehow had to honor both tradition and the unique circumstances of this particular loss. "We estimate that 2 million people may line the funeral route," the cabinet secretary explained, pointing to various locations marked on a large-scale map of central London. "We're coordinating with the Metropolitan Police to ensure public safety while allowing as many people as possible to pay their respects." Catherine studied the route, imagining the crowds that would gather, the children lifted onto their parents' shoulders to catch a glimpse of history, the elderly brought in wheelchairs to witness one final farewell. The responsibility of getting every detail right felt overwhelming, but she also felt the importance of creating a moment that would help the nation process its collective grief. "What about the international response?" William asked, knowing that this would be more than a British occasion, that leaders from around the world would want to participate in honoring someone who had been a global figure for so many decades. "Unprecedented," the Foreign Secretary replied, consulting a thick folder of diplomatic correspondence. Every major world leader has requested to attend. Presidents, prime ministers, kings, and queens, religious leaders. We're having to expand our original capacity estimates significantly. The conversation continued for over an hour, covering everything from the music that would be performed to the specific words that would be engraved on commemorative items. Every decision required careful consideration of tradition, public sentiment, and practical constraints. William and Catherine listened intently, occasionally asking questions or suggesting modifications, aware that they were helping to craft an event that would provide closure for millions of people. When the formal meeting concluded, the Prime Minister asked to speak with William privately. Catherine was escorted to a smaller room where tea was served, and she could review some of the personal messages that had been received from other royal families around the world. The letter from the Queen of Denmark was particularly moving, recalling a friendship that had spanned decades, and sharing memories of private conversations and shared experiences that would never be made public. The King of Spain had written about lessons in leadership and grace that had influenced his own approach to monarchy. Each message carried the weight of personal loss combined with official recognition of a life dedicated to service. Meanwhile, in the Prime Minister's study, William was having a different kind of conversation. Away from the formal protocols and detailed planning, the two men spoke more openly about the emotional weight of the days ahead. "I've been Prime Minister for 3 years now," the older man said, settling into a leather chair by the window, "and she was always available when I needed guidance. Not interfering, mind you, just offering the perspective that comes from 7 decades of experience. I'm going to miss that wisdom terribly." William nodded, understanding the sentiment completely. She had this way of listening that made you feel like your problems were the most important thing in the world, even though you knew she was dealing with much larger issues than anything you could bring to her. "How are you holding up?" the Prime Minister asked, his question more personal than official. "This can't be easy, balancing your own grief with everything that needs to be done." William considered his answer carefully. "Some moments are harder than others," he admitted. "When I'm focused on the arrangements, on making sure everything goes smoothly, it feels manageable. But then something will remind me that she's really gone, and it hits me all over again." They talked about the unique challenges of grieving in public, of having to maintain composure when what you really wanted was the privacy to fall apart completely. The Prime Minister shared his own experiences with loss, offering the kind of understanding that could only come from someone who had also had to carry on with important work while dealing with personal tragedy. When William rejoined Catherine, he found her writing notes in a small leather journal she always carried. She looked up as he entered, and he could see that reading the international messages had affected her deeply. "They all loved her," she said simply. "Not just respected her or admired her, but actually loved her." The Queen of the Netherlands wrote about how she helped her through her first years as a young royal. The Emperor of Japan mentioned personal conversations they had about the challenges of preserving tradition while embracing change. William sat beside her, taking her hand. She would be amazed by all of this, wouldn't she? She always thought of herself as just doing her job, never fully understanding the impact she had on people. Their next appointment was at Westminster Abbey, where they would review the funeral arrangements with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Abbey's senior staff. The car ride through central London revealed even more evidence of the nation's response to the loss. Flags flew at half-mast on government buildings. Shop windows displayed respectful messages, and impromptu memorial sites had appeared in parks and town squares across the city. Westminster Abbey felt different than usual when they arrived. The ancient building, which had hosted coronations, weddings, and funerals for nearly 1,000 years, seemed to pulse with a quiet energy as preparations were made for another historic ceremony. Scaffolding was being erected for cameras, additional seating areas were being marked out, and sound engineers were testing equipment that would carry the service to billions of viewers worldwide. The Archbishop greeted them with the same combination of professional competence and personal warmth they had experienced at Downing Street. He had known the deceased for decades, had officiated at family celebrations and supported them through difficult times, and his own grief was evident beneath his composed exterior. She once told me, the Archbishop shared as they walked through the nave, that she hoped when her time came, the service would focus more on giving thanks for a life well lived than on mourning what was lost. She wanted people to leave feeling inspired to serve others, not just sad that she was gone. Catherine felt a chill as she imagined the abbey filled to capacity, the voices of thousands joining in hymns of remembrance and celebration. She thought about their own children who would be attending their first state funeral, learning firsthand about the solemnity and pageantry of such occasions. "What about the children?" she asked the Archbishop. "How do we help them understand what's happening without overwhelming them?" "Children often handle these situations better than adults," he replied kindly. "They see the ceremony, the music, the beauty of it all, and they understand that it's about love and remembrance. We can prepare them by explaining that it's a special service to say thank you for someone's life and to promise that we won't forget them." They spent time reviewing the order of service, discussing readings and musical selections that would honor both religious tradition and personal preferences. The balance between state ceremonial and spiritual meaning required careful attention, ensuring that the service would speak to people of all faiths while respecting the Christian framework of the Church of England. As they prepared to leave the abbey, William and Catherine stood together in the space where the ceremony would take place. The late afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting patterns of color across the stone floors where kings and queens had been crowned, where poets and scientists had been honored, where the great moments of British history had been marked and remembered. "She'll be here with us," Catherine said quietly, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "During the service, when we're all saying goodbye, I think we'll feel her presence somehow." William squeezed her hand, thinking about all the conversations they'd had about faith, about the mystery of what happens after death, about the connections that transcend physical presence. Neither of them was certain about the specifics of an afterlife, but both felt strongly that love and influence continue long after a person's physical departure. Their final appointment of the day was back at Kensington Palace, where they met with the children's counselor who had been brought in to help George, Charlotte, and Louis process what was happening. The psychologist was an expert in helping young people deal with loss, and she had prepared materials and activities designed to help children understand death and grief in age-appropriate ways. "The most important thing," she explained to William and Catherine, "is to be honest with them while also providing reassurance about their own security and the continuity of their lives. Children need to know that while this is very sad, they are still safe and loved." They discussed how to explain the funeral ceremony to the children, how to prepare them for the emotions they might see in adults around them, and how to answer the difficult questions that children inevitably ask when confronted with mortality. The counselor emphasized the importance of maintaining normal routines as much as possible, while also allowing space for the children to express their own feelings and confusion. "George is old enough to understand more than the younger ones," Catherine observed. "He's asking very direct questions about where she is now and whether they'll see her again. Charlotte is more focused on the immediate changes, wondering why everyone is so sad and when things will go back to normal." "And Louis?" the counselor asked. "He knows something important is happening," William replied. "But at his age, he's more affected by the emotions around him than by understanding the actual situation. He's been more clingy than usual, wanting extra reassurance that we're not going anywhere." The counselor provided them with books and activities that could help facilitate conversations with the children, tools for helping them express their feelings through drawing or play, and guidance on recognizing signs of distress that might require additional support. As evening approached, and their official obligations for the day came to an end, William and Catherine finally had time to be alone with their thoughts and each other. They walked through the private gardens of Kensington Palace, away from the crowds and cameras, finding peace in the quiet spaces that had become their refuge over the years. The children joined them for dinner, and the conversation around the table was a careful balance of normal family life and acknowledgement of the extraordinary circumstances they were all living through. George asked about the funeral preparations. Charlotte wanted to know if they could visit the flower memorials that were growing near the palace gates, and Louis simply enjoyed having both his parents' undivided attention. After the children were in bed, William and Catherine sat together in their private sitting room, finally able to drop the composed faces they had worn throughout the day. The exhaustion was overwhelming, but so was the sense of purpose that came from knowing they were helping to guide the nation through a difficult time. I keep thinking about what she would say if she could see all of this, Catherine mused, curled up against William's side on the sofa. All the attention, all the preparation, all the people who were grieving. She would probably be a bit embarrassed by the fuss. William smiled at the accuracy of that assessment. She'd be more concerned about whether we were taking care of ourselves and the children than about any of the ceremonial details. She always said that the most important part of public service was remembering that you're a person first. They talked late into the evening, sharing memories, expressing fears about the days ahead, and drawing strength from their partnership. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more decisions, more public appearances where their private grief would be displayed for the world to see. But tonight, in the quiet of their home, they could simply be a husband and wife facing loss together, supporting each other through one of the most difficult periods of their lives. The morning of the funeral dawned gray and misty, with a soft rain that seemed fitting for such a solemn occasion. Catherine stood at the bedroom window, watching the early preparations taking place in the courtyard below. Security personnel moved with quiet efficiency, checking and rechecking arrangements that had been planned down to the smallest detail. William was already dressed in his formal military uniform, the ceremonial sword at his side, catching the light as he moved. The weight of the day ahead was visible in his posture, the way he carried himself with extra formality, as if the uniform itself was armor against the emotional challenge that lay before them. "The children are awake," Catherine said softly, turning from the window. She was dressed in black, a hat with a delicate veil positioned carefully on her head. Her jewelry was simple but meaningful, pearl earrings that had been a gift, a brooch that carried personal significance. They had decided that all three children would attend the funeral, despite concerns about their ages and the length of the ceremony. George, at 9, was old enough to understand the historical importance of what was happening. Charlotte and Louis would follow their brother's lead, supported by careful preparation and the presence of their nanny throughout the service. The family gathered in the breakfast room, where a simple meal had been prepared. None of them had much appetite, but the ritual of eating together provided a sense of normalcy before the day's extraordinary events began. George sat quietly, dressed in his own formal clothes, asking occasional questions about the ceremony and the people who would be attending. Will there really be kings and queens from other countries? Charlotte asked, her 7-year-old imagination captured by the pageantry that would unfold. "Yes, sweetheart," Catherine replied, helping Louis with his breakfast. "Many important people from around the world are coming to say goodbye and to show their respect." "Why is it so important?" George asked, his question carrying the directness that children bring to complex situations. William considered his answer carefully. Because sometimes there are people who spend their whole lives helping others and making the world a better place. When someone like that dies, it's important for everyone who loved them to come together and say thank you for everything they did. The explanation seemed to satisfy the children, who returned to their breakfast with the resilience that young people possess when faced with situations they cannot fully comprehend, but accept as part of their reality. A gentle knock at the door signaled that it was time to leave. The family's protection officers waited respectfully in the hallway, ready to escort them through what would be one of the most scrutinized and emotionally charged days any of them had ever experienced. The children were loaded into a separate car with their nanny, while William and Catherine traveled together in the state vehicle that would carry them through the streets of London. As they settled into the back seat, Catherine reached for William's hand, finding comfort in the familiar gesture that had sustained them through countless public appearances over the years. The route to Westminster Abbey took them past thousands of people who had risen before dawn to secure viewing spots along the funeral procession. Many had been waiting for hours. Some had traveled from distant parts of the country, all united in their desire to participate in this moment of national farewell. Catherine watched the faces in the crowd, seeing the same mixture of sadness and affection that she felt in her own heart. There were elderly people who remembered 7 decades of dedicated service, middle-aged adults who had grown up seeing this figure as a constant presence in their lives, and young families with children perched on their shoulders, witnessing history in the making. "Look at them all," Catherine whispered, her voice filled with wonder. She would be so moved to see how many people's lives she touched. The crowd's response as their car passed was respectful, but warm, gentle applause, and called out expressions of sympathy that somehow managed to be both personal and appropriately formal. People held up photographs and homemade signs, threw flowers into the street, and called out words of comfort to the couple who had become the focal point for the nation's grief. Westminster Abbey appeared ahead of them, its ancient towers reaching toward the cloudy sky like fingers pointing toward something beyond earthly understanding. The building had been transformed for the occasion, with additional seating areas, sophisticated camera positions, and security measures that were invisible but comprehensive. As they approached the Abbey, Catherine could see the children's car arriving at the same time, and she felt a surge of maternal protectiveness mixed with pride. Her children were about to participate in an event of historical significance, learning lessons about duty, service, and the power of collective mourning that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The family regrouped at the Abbey entrance, where they were greeted by the Archbishop of Canterbury and other senior clergy who would conduct the service. George stood close to his father, unconsciously mimicking William's formal posture, while Charlotte and Louis stayed near Catherine, their eyes wide as they took in the grandeur of their surroundings. "Remember what we talked about," Catherine whispered to the children as they prepared to enter the Abbey. "This is a special ceremony to celebrate a wonderful life and to say thank you for everything she gave to all of us." The Abbey was filled to capacity, with nearly 2,000 attendees representing every aspect of public life. World leaders sat alongside charity workers. Members of the royal family were interspersed with ordinary citizens who had been honored for their own service to others. The diversity of the congregation reflected the breadth of influence and connection that had characterized the life they were celebrating. As the family processed down the aisle, Catherine felt the weight of history pressing down on her. The same stones beneath her feet had supported the footsteps of monarchs for nearly 1,000 years. The same walls had echoed with prayers and proclamations that had shaped the course of nations. Today, they were adding their own chapter to that long story of ceremony and significance. The service itself was a masterpiece of balance between personal grief and public celebration. The Archbishop's words spoke to both the private loss felt by the family and the collective mourning of a nation. The music, performed by choirs whose voices filled the ancient space with ethereal beauty, somehow managed to be both mournful and uplifting, acknowledging loss while celebrating the enduring impact of a life well lived. Catherine watched William throughout the ceremony, seeing him struggle to maintain his composure as readings and prayers evoked powerful memories of the person they were honoring. She could see the moment when a particular hymn, one that had been sung at their wedding, nearly broke through his carefully maintained emotional control. The children behaved beautifully, following the order of service with careful attention and standing and sitting in unison with the rest of the congregation. George's face showed his understanding of the solemnity of the occasion, while Charlotte and Louis seemed caught up in the pageantry and music, participating in their own way in the collective expression of love and farewell. When the time came for the eulogy, delivered by a close family friend rather than a political figure, the words painted a picture of someone who had lived with extraordinary grace under impossible pressure, who had dedicated every day of her adult life to serving others, and who had somehow managed to remain genuinely human despite being placed on the highest of pedestals. She taught us, the speaker said, his voice carrying clearly through the Abbey sound system, that true leadership is not about commanding others, but about inspiring them. Not about being perfect, but about being authentic. Not about seeking glory, but about quietly doing what needs to be done day after day, year after year. The words resonated with Catherine, who thought about her own role and the example that had been set for her. She felt the responsibility of carrying forward that legacy of service, of finding ways to honor the lessons she had learned, while also bringing her own perspective and energy to the challenges of modern royal life. As the ceremony neared its conclusion, Catherine noticed that many in the congregation were crying openly. The collective expression of grief was powerful and healing, a shared acknowledgement of loss that somehow made the burden easier to bear. She saw world leaders wiping away tears, charity workers reaching for handkerchiefs, ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by decades of dedicated service allowing themselves to mourn publicly and without shame. The final hymn was one that had special meaning for the family, a piece that had been chosen specifically because of happy memories associated with it. As 2,000 voices joined together in song, Catherine felt something shift in her own emotional landscape. The overwhelming sadness was still there, but it was joined by something else: gratitude for having been part of such an extraordinary life and determination to honor that legacy in her own way. When the service ended and the family began the procession out of the Abbey, Catherine felt both drained and strangely energized. The formal part of the farewell was complete, but she knew that the real work of processing grief and moving forward was just beginning. Outside the Abbey, the crowd had swelled to enormous proportions. The funeral procession would wind through central London, giving millions of people the opportunity to participate in this moment of national unity. The family entered the horse-drawn carriage that would carry them on the final journey, and Catherine positioned herself so that she could wave to the crowds while keeping a protective eye on her children. The carriage moved slowly through streets lined with people 20 deep in some places. The atmosphere was extraordinary, respectful but warm, mournful but somehow celebratory. People threw flowers, applauded gently, called out expressions of love and support that seemed to come from the depths of their hearts. Catherine was moved to tears by a group of school children who had been given special permission to leave their classes to attend the funeral. They stood in perfect rows, their small faces serious with understanding of the importance of what they were witnessing. When they saw the royal family's carriage approaching, they began to wave with the enthusiastic joy that only children possess, their simple gestures of affection cutting through all the ceremony and protocol to touch something fundamental about human connection and love. "Mummy, why are all these people here?" Louis asked, his 4-year-old curiosity undimmed by the solemnity of the occasion. "Because they loved her very much," Catherine replied, her own voice thick with emotion. "And they want to say goodbye properly, to show their respect and their gratitude for everything she did for them." The procession continued for over an hour, winding through neighborhoods that represented every aspect of London life. In affluent areas, people watched from elegant balconies decorated with respectful displays of flowers and flags. In working-class districts, entire families had gathered on the streets, some having waited since before dawn to secure good viewing positions. What struck Catherine most forcefully was the diversity of the crowd. People of every age, every ethnicity, every social class, all brought together by shared loss and common respect for someone who had somehow managed to represent all of them while remaining uniquely herself. She saw elderly veterans standing at attention in their old uniforms, Young mothers holding babies who would grow up with no memory of this moment, but would inherit its legacy. Teenagers who had taken time away from their digital lives to participate in something ancient and meaningful. As they approached the final destination, where the private burial would take place away from the public eye, Catherine felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The public part of the farewell was ending, but that meant the beginning of a more private, more personal process of grief and adjustment. The carriage drew to a stop, and the family stepped down onto ground that would forever be associated with this day, this moment, this ending and beginning. The children were tired, but had conducted themselves with remarkable grace throughout the long ceremony. George helped his younger siblings down from the carriage, unconsciously taking on a protective role that reminded Catherine of William's own relationship with his brother. As they prepared to enter the private chapel for the final part of the service, Catherine looked back one last time at the crowds that were beginning to disperse. Tomorrow, life would resume its normal rhythms, but something fundamental had changed in the national consciousness. A chapter had ended, and a new one was beginning, with all the uncertainty and possibility that such transitions bring. The private service was intimate and personal, attended only by close family and a few lifelong friends. Without the cameras and crowds, the family could finally allow themselves to grieve openly, to say their personal goodbyes without the weight of public observation and expectation. Catherine held William's hand as they listened to personal reminiscences and private prayers, feeling the strange mixture of endings and beginnings that define all significant transitions. Tomorrow, they would wake up in a world that felt different, where they would need to find new ways to carry forward the responsibilities and privileges that have been entrusted to them. But tonight, as the sun set on this day of national mourning and celebration, she felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, strengthened by the love they had witnessed, inspired by the example that had been set for them, and united with William and their children in their commitment to serve others with the same grace and dedication they had learned from someone who had shown them what a life of service really meant. 3 weeks after the funeral, life was slowly finding its new rhythm at Kensington Palace. The constant stream of condolence letters had slowed to a manageable flow. The media attention had shifted to other stories, and the family was beginning to navigate their changed world with growing confidence. Catherine stood in the private study, surrounded by thousands of letters and cards from people around the world who had wanted to share their memories and express their sympathy. Each envelope represented a personal connection, a life that had been touched by someone they were all still learning to live without. "Listen to this one," Catherine said to William, who was seated at the desk working through official correspondence. She held up a letter written in careful children's handwriting. It's from an 8-year-old girl in Wales. She writes, "Dear Princess Kate, I am very sorry about your grandma. My grandma died last year, and I know it makes you very sad. I drew you a picture of her with angels, because that's where she is now. Please don't be too sad, because she will always love you even from heaven." William looked up from his work, his expression softening. "The children's letters are the hardest ones to read," he said. "They understand loss in such a pure way, without all the complications that adults bring to it." The drawing that accompanied the letter showed a simple but touching scene of a figure surrounded by winged angels, all rendered in bright colors that somehow made the subject of death seem less frightening. Catherine carefully placed it in the special box where they were keeping the most meaningful correspondence, knowing that someday she would want to look back at these expressions of love and support. Over the past 3 weeks, William and Catherine had thrown themselves into their work with renewed energy and purpose. They had attended memorial services, visited charities that had been particularly close to their hearts, and begun planning new initiatives that would honor the legacy of service that had been entrusted to them. "The hospital visit went well yesterday," William remarked, referring to their trip to a children's ward where they'd spent time with young patients and their families. The staff said it was the first time some of those children had smiled in weeks. "It reminded me why this work matters so much. Catherine nodded, thinking about the little boy they had met who was fighting leukemia. When they had walked into his room, his face had lit up with joy, temporarily forgetting his illness in the excitement of meeting real-life royalty. His mother had whispered to Catherine that it was the first time her son had shown interest in anything since his diagnosis. She always said that the best part of royal duties was the chance to bring a little happiness to people who were going through difficult times, Catherine recalled. Yesterday, I finally understood what she meant. When we walked into that hospital room and saw that little boy's face, I felt her presence with us. The children had adapted to their new reality with the resilience that young people possess. George had returned to school and was throwing himself into his studies with increased seriousness, as if he understood that his own responsibilities would someday be greater than he had previously imagined. Charlotte had become more affectionate with her parents, seeking extra hugs and reassurance, while Louis continued to live in the moment with the carefree attitude of a 4-year-old. George asked me yesterday if he would be king someday, William shared, his voice reflecting the complexity of emotions that such questions evoked. I told him that it was possible, but that for now his job was just to be a good person and to learn as much as he could about the world. What did he say to that? Catherine asked, curious about how their eldest son was processing the implications of his position. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked if being king meant he would have to help people the way she did. When I told him yes, he seemed satisfied with that answer. I think he's beginning to understand that privilege comes with responsibility. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Their private secretary entered with the day's schedule, a carefully balanced mixture of official duties and family time that reflected their commitment to maintaining normalcy while fulfilling their public responsibilities. The children's hospice visit is at 11, he informed them, followed by the memorial garden dedication at 2. The rest of the afternoon is clear for family time. Catherine felt a familiar flutter of nervous energy at the mention of the hospice visit. These were always the most emotionally challenging engagements, requiring them to bring comfort and hope to families facing unimaginable difficulties. But they were also among the most meaningful, providing opportunities to make a real difference in people's lives during their darkest moments. As they prepared to leave for their first engagement, Catherine found herself thinking about the lessons in compassion she had learned over the years. She remembered being told that the key to these visits was to focus completely on the people you were meeting, to set aside your own concerns, and truly listen to their stories and needs. The Children's Hospice was a beautiful building designed to feel more like a home than a medical facility. Gardens provided peaceful spaces for reflection, while playrooms offered opportunities for joy and laughter even in the midst of serious illness. The staff had clearly put enormous thought into creating an environment that would support both the young patients and their families during the most difficult period of their lives. Your Royal Highnesses, the hospice director greeted them warmly. Thank you so much for coming. The children and families are so excited to meet you. As they toured the facility, William and Catherine were struck by the atmosphere of love and hope that permeated every room. Despite the serious nature of the illnesses being treated there was laughter echoing through the hallways, artwork covering the walls, and a sense of community among the families who had found support in each other. In the main playroom, they met Sarah, a 6-year-old girl with a rare genetic condition that would likely shorten her life significantly. Despite her illness, Sarah was full of energy and curiosity, immediately engaging Catherine in a conversation about her favorite books and her pet rabbit at home. "Are you really a princess?" Sarah asked with the directness that only children possess. "I am," Catherine replied, kneeling down to Sarah's level. "But I'm also a mommy, just like your mommy. I have 3 children at home who like to play games and read stories, just like you do." Sarah's face lit up with delight. "Do they like fairy tales?" "My mommy reads me fairy tales every night before bed." "They love fairy tales," Catherine assured her. "What's your favorite one?" As Sarah launched into an animated description of Cinderella and why it was the best story ever written, Catherine felt the familiar mixture of heartbreak and inspiration that these visits always evoked. Here was a little girl facing challenges that no child should have to endure, yet she remained capable of joy, curiosity, and hope. Catherine spent nearly an hour with Sarah and her family, listening to stories about their journey through illness and treatment, learning about the support they had received from the hospice staff, and marveling at their resilience and positive attitude. Sarah's parents spoke about the importance of making every day count, of finding joy in small moments, and of the comfort they found in knowing that their daughter was surrounded by love. Meanwhile, William was in another part of the hospice, meeting with teenage patients who were dealing with their own serious diagnoses. These conversations were different, but equally powerful, as young people who were facing mortality far too early share their thoughts about life, hope, and what really mattered to them. One 15-year-old boy, diagnosed with brain cancer, had started a blog about his treatment experience that had gained thousands of followers around the world. "I wanted to show people that you can still find good things, even when everything seems terrible," he explained to William. "Like, yesterday, I had chemo, which was awful, but then my little sister drew me this amazing picture of superheroes, and it made me laugh so hard I forgot about feeling sick." William was moved by the young man's wisdom and courage. "You're inspiring a lot of people with your writing," he told him. "Sometimes the most important thing we can do is share our stories honestly, so other people going through similar experiences don't feel so alone." When it came time to leave the hospice, both William and Catherine felt emotionally drained but also energized by the connections they had made. The staff gathered to say goodbye, and the director presented them with a photo album containing pictures and messages from all the families they had met. "You've given these families something precious," the director told them. "Not just the excitement of meeting you, but the feeling that their children matter, that their stories are important, that they're not forgotten. That means more than you can possibly know." As they drove to their next engagement, the Memorial Garden dedication, Catherine found herself thinking about the lessons she had learned that morning. The families at the hospice had shown her something profound about finding meaning and purpose even in the face of loss and suffering. "Those children," she said to William as their car navigated through London traffic, "they have such wisdom. That little girl Sarah asked me if being a princess meant I got to help people, and when I said yes, she said that sounded like the best job in the world." "Out of the mouths of babes," William replied thoughtfully. "Sometimes I think children understand the important things better than adults do." The Memorial Garden was being dedicated in a small park in South London, a community space that had been transformed into a place of beauty and reflection. Local residents had contributed time and money to create something meaningful in memory of the person they were all mourning, and the garden represented the best of community spirit and collective action. As William and Catherine walked through the garden, they were impressed by the thoughtfulness that had gone into every detail. Native plants provided year-round beauty, benches offered spaces for quiet contemplation, and a small water feature created a sense of peace and tranquility. A memorial plaque, simple but elegant, bore words of gratitude and remembrance. "This is exactly what she would have wanted," Catherine observed, reading the inscription that emphasized service to others and the importance of community. Something practical and beautiful that would benefit people for generations to come. The crowd gathered for the dedication was made up primarily of local residents. People who had organized fundraising events, volunteered their time, and contributed their skills to make the garden a reality. They ranged from elderly residents who remembered decades of dedicated service to young families who wanted to teach their children about the importance of giving back to their community. During the dedication ceremony, several community members spoke about what the garden meant to them and about the inspiration they had drawn from the example of selfless service. A local teacher talked about bringing her students to the garden for outdoor lessons, helping them learn about nature while also learning about citizenship and responsibility. "This garden will be here long after we're all gone," she said, addressing the crowd gathered for the ceremony. "It will teach our children and our children's children about the importance of creating something beautiful and meaningful for others to enjoy. Catherine was asked to say a few words during the ceremony, and she spoke about the power of community action and the way that individual contributions, when combined, could create something much greater than the sum of its parts. She talked about the garden as a symbol of hope and continuity, a place where people could find peace and inspiration for generations to come. Gardens require patience, she observed, looking out at the crowd of neighbors and friends who had made this project possible. You plant seeds not knowing exactly how they'll grow. You tend them carefully through all kinds of weather, and you trust that something beautiful will emerge. In many ways, that's what service to others is like too. We do our part, we care for our communities, and we trust that our efforts will contribute to something larger and more beautiful than we can imagine on our own. After the formal ceremony, William and Catherine spent time walking through the garden with its creators, learning about the specific plants that had been chosen, the design decisions that had been made, and the community organizations that had contributed to the project. It was clear that this was more than just a memorial. It was a living symbol of the values and principles that continued to inspire people even after their original source was gone. As they prepared to leave, Catherine was approached by an elderly woman who had been one of the garden's primary organizers. "Thank you for coming," the woman said, her eyes bright with tears. She would have loved this place, wouldn't she? All these people working together to create something beautiful. "She would have been amazed by what you've accomplished," Catherine replied warmly. And she would have been so proud to know that her example inspired people to come together like this. The drive back to Kensington Palace took them through neighborhoods that showed signs of the continuing impact of the loss the nation had experienced. Flags still flew at half-mast on some buildings, memorial flowers were still being placed at significant locations, and there was a palpable sense that the country was still processing what had happened and what it meant for the future. "I've been thinking about legacy," Catherine said as they neared home. "Not just the big, obvious things like state ceremonies and official commemorations, but the small, everyday ways that her influence continues. Like that garden, like the hospice we visited this morning, like all the people who are trying a little harder to be kind and helpful because of the example she set." William nodded, understanding what she meant. "I think that's what she would want most. Not to be remembered for the pomp and ceremony, but for the idea that each of us has the power to make life a little better for the people around us." When they arrived home, they were greeted by their children, who had spent the day with their tutors and were eager to share what they had learned. George had been working on a history project about the Victorian era, Charlotte had been practicing piano, and Louis had been in the garden with his nanny, learning about different types of flowers. "Daddy, did you see any beautiful gardens today?" Charlotte asked, somehow sensing that their father's afternoon had been spent in similar surroundings to her own. "We did," William replied, lifting her up for a hug. "We saw a garden that people built together to remember someone special, and it was full of flowers and peaceful places to sit and think." "Like our garden here?" Louis asked, pointing toward the private gardens that surrounded their home. "Very much like our garden," Catherine agreed. "A place where people can go when they want to feel calm and happy." As evening approached and the family settled into their evening routine, Catherine reflected on the day's experiences. The hospice visit had reminded her of the preciousness of life and the importance of bringing joy to people facing difficult circumstances. The garden dedication had shown her the power of community action and the way that shared grief could be transformed into something beautiful and lasting. That night, after the children were in bed, William and Catherine sat together in their private sitting room, sharing their thoughts about the day and their ongoing process of adjustment to their changed world. They talked about the letters they had received, the people they had met, and the growing sense that they were finding their way forward while honoring the past. "I think we're beginning to understand what comes next," Catherine said, curled up beside William on the sofa. "Not trying to replace what we've lost, but finding our own way to carry forward the things that mattered most to her." William agreed, thinking about the conversations they'd had with the children, the connections they'd made during their visits, and the gradual emergence of a new sense of purpose and direction. She prepared us for this, he said. Maybe not intentionally, but through everything she taught us about service and duty and finding joy in helping others. 3 weeks after the funeral that had brought the nation together in grief, William and Catherine were discovering that mourning and moving forward were not mutually exclusive. They could honor the past while embracing the future, could feel sadness for what was lost while also feeling gratitude for what remained. Outside their windows, London continued its ancient rhythm of renewal and change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve, new chances to comfort those in need, and to celebrate the good things that made life worth living. The loss they had all experienced would always be with them, but so would the lessons they had learned about love, service, and the enduring power of human connection. As they prepared for bed, Catherine thought about the letter she had written on the morning after the loss was announced, the private words she had addressed to someone who could no longer hear them, but whose influence would continue to guide their choices for years to come. The farewell had been said, the grief had been shared, and now the real work of living up to the example that had been set for them was just beginning.